This is actually the first time I've given a presentation on this topic, so I think it's a bit of a work in progress. I think Carol's talk was a very really excellent way to start, and was very informative to me as well. And I think there's a little bit of overlap in some of the things. Okay, so just start. So I'm going to talk about peer review and giving feedback, which of course are related to one another. So I looked up the definition of peer review. After 20 odd years of being involved in peer review, I thought I'd better find out what it was. So this is the sort of thing, if you just do a Google search on peer review. Evaluation of scientific, academic or professional work by others working in the same field, which I think is what we think peer review is. Evaluation of work by one or more people of similar competence to the producers of the work. So I think we understand what peer review is. And I think the role of peer review is to maintain standards of quality, to improve performance, which is where the feedback comes into it, and to provide credibility. And it could be credibility to the people to the person who's being peer reviewed, or it could be credibility to whatever the organisation that is giving the peer review is. So I think, for me, peer review is about standard setting, about education for improvement. Again, that's the feedback element. I think it's about gatekeeping. So for a journal, for example, would want to maintain its standards, so making sure that any paper that is accepted is of a certain quality. And I think related to that is the quality assurance. It could be quality assurance for a journal, for a funding agency, for an institution that is receiving funding, for example, says something about the quality of the process. Feedback, I think Carol's much covered this and much more expert, but it's information about a person's performance of a task which is used as the basis for improvement. And again, it could be improvement on a paper, a grant application, or whatever. And I think the other thing for me, which is actually the point that we were touching on when we were talking about this contentious sentence, which is in the context of peer review, feedback is also used to provide evidence in support of the outcome. So if you reject the paper or reject the grant application, the feedback actually has to make it very clear to the recipient what the basis for the decision is. And of course for rejection, that's very important to the receiver. For acceptance, actually, it's, I think, much less important because people are happy they've got their grant or had their paper accepted, and they're not that interested in what the basis for the positive outcome is. But for a negative outcome, it's very important. And I think it also avoids confusion for the recipient, and it might avoid what you might call adverse responses from the recipient, like, why are you rejecting my paper? Why didn't I get my grant? And so on. So it's the clarity, I think. So I was thinking about when do we use peer review and feedback in a research context. So I'm away from the education context, but in a research context. So obviously I've mentioned papers for publication, which I think is what we most commonly think of. Applications for research funding, which you're very interested in. Of course, your approval to make an application for funding. So in medicine, we're not supposed to submit grant applications without them having had some sort of internal peer review, which my impression is can be very light touch and may just be rightly or wrongly a box-ticking exercise in a lot of cases. But there are some other things, applications for career advancement and promotion. So if you want to become a professor in the University of Southampton, your CV is reviewed by your peers from outside of the university, for example. Of course, academic prizes, competitions, things like that. Abstracts submitted to congresses. Many of us get involved in the very tedious reviewing of hundreds of abstracts submitted to congresses. And the other thing I thought of actually is I believe that although examination of a PhD or a DM is a university examination, it's not an examination in the normal context of an examination. And I think actually assessment of doctoral theses is a type of peer review. Because somebody reads the thesis, then they sit with the person and talk about it for a few hours, and then they write some feedback and they give them some verbal feedback, and most often the recipient has an opportunity to improve the thesis before it's passed. And that's not the way as an exam normally works in a university setting, certainly. So I think examining the doctoral thesis actually is a type of peer review. So I just wanted to give you my credentials, which explain why I'm standing in front of you now. So I am a university-based academic. I publish papers, published a lot of papers. I've been very fortunate, but I've been doing that for a long time now. Published my first paper in 1980, actually. Obviously, I apply unsuccessfully for research funding. I do every now and then apply for promotion or career advancement. I have been nominated for or applied for prizes. Of course, I do have students who present doctoral theses, but they're the ones being peer reviewed then, not me. So I am subject to and receipt of peer review and feedback continuously in an academic setting. I have served on editorial boards of many journals. I was editor-in-chief of British Journal of Nutrition from 2005 to 2013. I'm an associate editor on many journals, and roughly speaking, I don't track this, but I probably make decisions on about 250 papers a year. So that is reject, revise, or accept. I'm a frequent peer reviewer for journals, and I figure I probably review about 200 papers a year for other journals. It may even be more than that, I don't count them. I review a lot of grant applications, particularly RDS SC, MRC, British Heart Foundation, Wellcome Trust. I've peer reviewed quite a number of applications from people at different universities, particularly for elevations to personal chairs, abstracts, examined a lot of doctoral theses, and also I frequently discuss issues related to peer review with other journal editors. That's a very common thing when you meet an editor of another journal. After you've said hello, the first thing they ask you is, how's your journal going? And that uses the next 20 minutes of the coffee break usually. So, because when you get journal editors talking about journals, you can't stop them. That's really their passion. And actually I wrote an editorial in British Journal of Nutrition about peer review. And the reason for that is all journals find it very difficult to get peer reviewers. In the journals I deal with, which are middle-ranking journals in nutrition, in lipidology, or in clinical science, it's not uncommon for us to need to ask 10 or 12 people to get 2 people to agree to a peer review. Okay, the most I've seen is probably getting up to the mid-20s to get 2 people to say yes. And then they don't always deliver. And if they do deliver, they may not be good peer reviews. So I wrote this editorial to plead with the nutrition community to engage much more in peer review. Okay? And I did an estimation in my own field of nutrition, which is a small discipline, how many peer review acts would be required every year. And roughly speaking, in nutrition, it would be about 100,000 a year. Okay? So if you think about another biomedical discipline like biochemistry, physiology, that number would be maybe 10 times greater. These are big, big numbers from small research communities. And peer review is really overburdened because of this. And the increasing numbers of journals are making that worse, although not all of those have very secure peer review processes. But that makes it a bit worse. So one of the things I said in this editorial was participation in peer review, so that's giving feedback, is part of an academic's professional responsibilities. It should be seen as a service to the discipline and one of the most important steps in maintaining standards and assuring scientific advancement. And I think that is a true statement. I don't know if it's recognised by our employing institutions, however, but I think that is one of the big issues. The second thing, in thinking about it, And this applies also to looking at grant applications, all of those things. That participation in peer review is an honour, it's a privilege. You're one of the first people to see new data, new interpretations in a grant application, new ideas. And their constructive criticism is welcomed by authors. Well, it should be, we'll come on to that. Since it serves to improve their thinking, that is of the authors, their manuscript, and the way they'll go about future experiments. Those who choose not to engage in peer review when they're both able and capable of doing so are not meeting one of their professional responsibilities and are doing this as a disservice and not treating their peers with the respect they deserve. So I thought a lot about the way of writing it, and I decided it was good to be harsh because we had a problem in getting people to engage. And I had to make it, just lay it on the line. This is how we see it, and you must engage. And one of the intriguing things is, and when you're an editor on a journal, you find out a lot of things about how other researchers behave, either as authors or as peer reviewers, and that's very fascinating. And one of the things that's very intriguing is a lot of people do not engage in peer review, but they submit their papers to that journal. And when they don't get a rapid response, they're on to the journal saying, why haven't I heard about my paper yet? Okay, and the answer is simple. I'm struggling to get the peer reviewers I need. Or I've got the peer reviewers, but they're being slow. And why don't you say yes next time you're asked by the journal? Okay? And some people find that a bit frightening, and they do say yes next time. You find out all these very interesting things. Karen and I were talking about it over coffee. You know, the things authors say to you when you reject their paper. Or the things people say to you before you've even made a decision on their paper. So I had one example where we were dealing with a paper and the senior author emailed me. This was a French researcher where they have their PhD thesis based on publications. Said, you must accept my student's paper. They're submitting their thesis next week. They need that paper. You must accept it. I wrote back saying, well, it's undergoing peer review. I can't promise anything, but you'll find out when the process is done. So people do these things, and they might do it in a positive way or in a negative way. So these are my observations. I've touched on some of these already. It's very difficult to find peer reviewers, that is, people to provide feedback. I think most peer reviewers are conscientious, that is, they try to do a good job. I do believe that. Peer review is also open to dubious practices. Journals and editors need to be vigilant about that. So, as you know, when you submit a paper, this doesn't happen with grant applications, but when you submit a paper, often a journal will say you can nominate some reviewers. Some papers won't allow you to submit, some journals won't allow you to submit the paper unless you have nominated reviewers. Of course, you nominate the people who are going to look on your work favourably. That is, you nominate your friends, or people you might have been working with, or your past students, or something like that. Those practices, I don't think are good, because what happens is, so one thing is, the positive thing is some of those people will agree to peer review. So when you're struggling to find peer reviewers, you know the friends of the authors might do that. So sometimes you're forced into that space. But also those people often have a very favourable view. The other thing that you might have heard of is fake reviewers. So there is a practice of people naming themselves as reviewers by giving themselves another name and owning another email address. And there are examples of this that have been exposed where people have reviewed their own papers. It sounds funny, but actually it's easy to do. So you name somebody, the journal says, okay, I'll use that person, and it goes back to you. I think a lot of peer reviewers, people giving feedback, don't follow the rules. for example, you should never say in a report to authors in a journal, this paper should be accepted, this paper should not be accepted. And in fact, you shouldn't do that with a grant application either, because you're not the person making, the peer reviewer is not the person making the decision. They are providing the evidence upon which the decision is made. So those sorts of things, so often you have to go in and edit the report or the thing. I think another observation, which I was talking to the young man in the corner about, is most people think their papers are better than they really are. So everybody thinks what they're doing is very good. When they put in their grant application, their fellowship application, their abstract to a meeting, their paper, they think what they're doing is really very good. And they can be very surprised at a negative outcome. So the other thing that's interesting is it's not uncommon for authors to contact journal editors. It would be much less common for applicants to contact funding bodies, although that can happen. But it's not uncommon for authors to contact journal editors with pleas to reverse decisions. This is very common. And just in the last, when I was preparing this, immediately before, I had an email from actually someone I knew elsewhere in the UK who had sent me an email saying, do you think a mistake was made when you prepared your decision letter? So he felt, perhaps because he knew me, that was a legitimate thing to say. Now what had happened was, he had 2 peer reviews on his article, and both of the peer reviewers, so when you review for a journal, you usually have a little box where you can communicate to the editor. And that's where people say what they really think. So they say, this paper should be rejected, or this paper isn't good enough for your journal, or something like that. In the bit to the authors, of course, as I'll come to, people are usually, should be a little bit less blunt than that, I think. So what had happened was, with his paper, both of the reviewers had said, this isn't really up to what your journal, this was clinical science, what your journal is after, at the standard. So this is about the gatekeeping. Good, solid paper, but not at that level. And their reviews actually were good reviews, but they wouldn't have convinced this individual that his paper should be rejected. So I simply replied to him and said, my response was based, or my decision was based upon the peer reviewer's report and their confidential comments to me. And he didn't come back, so he would have understood what had happened there. It's often surprising to people that editors, that authors contact editors, and people outside of the people in the institution, but outside of the academic core, find it quite surprising. But it happens a lot for all sorts of reasons. So what can often happen is a paper's rejected and an author will come back. And again, this wouldn't happen with a grant application normally, although I suspect sometimes people try this. An author will come back and say, actually, I think we can easily deal with everything that's been said. Will you reconsider? And sometimes you might say yes, sometimes you might say no. I mean, you treat that on a case-by-case basis. Because I think peer review isn't perfect, so mistakes happen. Mistakes happen with papers, mistakes happen with grant applications, mistakes happen with all of those things I listed actually. So I think you have to be, Carol said, a bit pragmatic about things as well. You talked about, I think, the emotion of the person receiving feedback. So I think the way I put it is authors can be very thin-skinned and sometimes irrationally so. And it comes back to the fact that people think what they've done is very good. And we see this all the way from the students right up to the professors, I think. People think what they've done is very good. I think this is true for papers, but I think it's even more so when it comes to funding applications, and maybe that's understandable. Because I think it's a reality that every paper is accepted eventually somewhere. Because it doesn't matter whether you resubmit your paper 20 times, in the end it will find a home. But for a grant application, often you put a lot into it, of course, and a lot is riding on it, people's jobs, for example, but also there may be a once-in-a-lifetime call that you miss out on because you haven't got that. So people can get a bit brassed off when they don't get their grant funded. I just said this, all papers and most other subjects of peer review are improved as a result of the peer review process. And again, I think we were talking about that over coffee. So the feedback always enhances the subject of the feedback, be it a paper, a grant application, a pre-approval, a doctoral thesis, whatever. Peer review always improves, always. So that has always got to be a message, I think, to people who are receiving peer review. What makes a good peer review? So remember the purpose. Standard setting, education for improvement, gatekeeping, and quality assurance. So I think what makes a good peer review, I mean, there will be some generic things, but of course the exact nature of what the peer review is being done for will impact exactly. So I think for a journal, standard setting is really, does it meet the norms for data collection, data analysis, presentation, study governance? Are the components all appropriate? So does it meet the standards of the discipline, I think? Education for improvement, clear feedback on areas that require improvement, which could be everything from study design and data analysis to presentation and language. Gatekeeping, mentioned this already once, does it meet the quality, that is of the science, of the analysis, of the presentation and writing, that readers would expect for the journal? I think on the next slide I have a funding application. So again, either, well, the reviewers would provide the evidence and the panel would make the decision, which is the gatekeeping. Is this the sort of thing, is this at the level of science that we would fund? Quality assurance. So I think authors and readers assure that what is presented and what it represents is in accord with the perceived quality of the journal. And that's really where the editorial level consideration comes about, although peer reviewers may feel they want to comment on that. For a funding application, the standard setting, I think, would be things like, is there a hypothesis? Is it sound? Is the reason for doing the study clear? What's the research gap? Are there pilot data? Does it meet the norms for design, data collection, analysis, etc., and other things? Education for improvement, clear feedback on areas that require improvement, any of those things. Gatekeeping, does it meet the quality that the funders would expect? Is it value for money? Other things, training opportunities, PPI, all of those sorts of things. Quality assurance. So the funders assure that what is funded is of good quality. They don't want to be spending the taxpayers' money or the people giving to charities money on things which are not good quality. So in advance of a funding application, it's all of those things again, I think. The standard setting areas, education for improvement, does it appear to meet the quality of what the funders would expect, which I think is one of the things that you would focus on with what you're looking at is, if you're going to NIHR or MIC or Wellcome Trust, is this, what they're likely to fund. And quality assurance, I think, in advance of a funding application is the institution as sure as it can be that what is submitted is of good quality, so is representing the institution in good light, and has a chance of success. Because I think the institution is interested in, obviously, its academics being able to bring in money, because that helps the institution going, improves the output, but also that the institution would be seen to be a place where good quality work is done. So for a journal, I think it's pretty straightforward, although a lot of people can't write papers very well. What is the study about? What was done? What was found? What it might mean? What's strong? What the limitations are? So this would be what you would provide in the feedback, I think. So a peer reviewer should say, this study investigates, it's a randomized controlled trial of 100 people with an intervention lasting 6 months. The main thing they found was that mortality was reduced. This means this. Seems to be a well-conducted trial. Statistical analysis is good. Weakness, small sample size, whatever. Detailed criticisms for attention and improvement. Clear feedback on areas that require improvement. Everything from study design and data analysis to presentation and language. I think this is my wording. You may use different wording, but I think it has to be very clear, so unambiguous. We talked a bit about that. I believe it should be polite, but polite in a professional way, and shouldn't be confrontational, okay? So it's got to be given in a good way. And I think what is written in the review has to support the decision that's made, and I touched on that a bit already. So it's the ammunition, if you like, it's the evidence. So this is an example. These are real, and they happened just in the last couple of weeks. Example of a poor peer review. A reviewer rated a paper in the top 25% of papers they'd seen. They said, except after minor revision. And this is all they put in the box. Minor typo on page 6. Line 2 down from 2.4. That was the extent of the peer review. Okay? This is telling the editor nothing. This is telling the author nothing except they made a spelling mistake. Okay? This is not useful. This is a very poor one, by the way, and not normal, but I did have it to hand. This is a good one. If you look in your presentation, this goes for several slides. Okay? And a professional in feedback might say that this is actually going beyond what is necessary. But what this says is, tells the person who's going to make a decision, this is what the research is about. They seem to offer a rationale, but there were other similar studies that are not discussed. They should acknowledge that, and then there are specific things to deal with. So some of these are relatively minor, but the introduction focuses on they don't review other trials, and then what they need to do. The authors need to briefly describe the state of the evidence for health benefits of almonds in individuals with type 2 diabetes. Why will this study contribute to the literature and fill the gaps? This is a very clear direction to the author. This is the problem. This is how you can solve it, deal with it. So if your paper is rejected, you have to do that. It might be that it requires revision. You will have to do that. The study purpose evolves in the last paragraph of the introduction, which is confusing for the reader. It seems the purpose was this, but many things are actually measured. The authors need to identify the primary objective, and does this objective address a deficiency in the literature? Again, a very clear direction. Exclusion criteria, what is the justification for? Then, a strength of the study is this. So this is something positive. The authors think, this reviewer liked something about my study. Then there's an issue, and it's stated this is a serious design flaw, but between here and here, the design flaw is described. So again, something to work on if this is rejected and is going to be sent elsewhere. The authors need to discuss, justify, Then there's some other thing. The study is powered on this. This is odd, since that isn't the primary outcome. I think a clear direction here. Other things here. The lack of differences is puzzling. Does almond processing to flour, this probably should say alter vitamin E content? This is a major limitation as it suggests adherence was poor. So And then there's some other minor things. Do not interpret data in the results. Clarify them. And still we're going here, other thing. The stated limitation that the duration of the current study was relatively short seems odd, as this was the purpose of the trial. We conducted a longer trial to examine the effect of almonds. So there's an internal inconsistency. They said they were doing a longer trial, and then they said a limitation as our trial was short. So again, clear guidance on how to fix up what they're actually saying. And if you do all 20 of those things, the abstract and the discussion will have to be revised accordingly. So this, I think, is a very thorough peer review. It's very professionally written and presented. It's critical, but supportive at the same time. So overall, I think there's a good balance in here. So I think be clear, be professional, be polite and respectful. I believe that's very important. Be thorough with the right amount of feedback. Ensure that what is written is able to support whatever the overall statement is, if you are the person providing the overall statement. Okay? So if I go back to this, and I happen to reject the paper, I'm going to get an automatic response from the author, why did you reject my paper? Okay? It so happens that I am going to reject this paper because I have 2 other peer reviews which are very extensive. Okay? So this wouldn't be very useful for rejecting a paper. So you have to make sure that what you have is supporting the overall statement. And I think, as shown by that, what I think is, this isn't the best example, it's just one for Journal of Nutrition that I had recently dealt with, because I went to Journal of Nutrition to find a good review to present to you. That was the first quite good one I found. So be critical, but be constructive. So constructive criticism, and I think when you're giving your feedback to people preparing applications, I think that's probably a key thing. You have to be critical to improve the quality, to get it where it wants to be, but you have to be constructive because you want to take the applicant with you. They've got to buy in. So that's it. I hope that was useful. I can answer any questions that as best I can anyway. So thanks so much.